I'll start. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. If you don't know me, my name is Aggie Toppins. I'm the chair of design here in the Sam Fox School, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, the 2019 through 2021 Louis D. Beaumont Artist-in-Residence, Jude Agboada. Many of you know Jude from his role in the classroom. He is a dedicated teacher in foundations and communication design. I have personally witnessed his depth of thought and sensitivity to form by teaching with him. Tonight, we have the honor and the opportunity to hear more about Jude's studio practice. Born in Kumasi, Ghana, Jude earned his undergraduate degree from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi. He holds an MFA in visual communication from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. In addition to being a branding expert, Jude creates artist books and spatial interventions that, in his words, explore the ways that people define community, identity, and culture. He connects with his readers on emotive and mnemonic levels, which are both intensely personal and related to public and political histories. Jude's work draws on the symbolic qualities of navigational signs as a poet deploys lyric to conjure memories. His talk is titled For Comfort to Comfort. If you have questions for Jude, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and we'll attend to the Q&A after the talk at the end of the session. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Jude Agboada.
I think I was on mute for a second there. Okay. Thank you so much, Aggie, for that introduction. I feel like I haven't got an introduction like that in a while, so that's great. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, let's see if I can do this right. Okay, hopefully you can all see my screen. Say yes, I guess so. Wait. Okay. All right. So hi everyone. Thanks for making the time to come and spend time with me for me to talk about my studio practice. And the title of my talk is basically For Comfort to Comfort. So the name of the title comes from, I was thinking for a while what to call my title and what to call my talk. And it's been hard just trying to like reflect, right? Because again, I think when you think about it, the idea of like reflection is really difficult to think about how far you've come, what you've been through, what you've done, and what that seems to mean as far as like how your practice is shaped. So as Aggie said in the introduction, my education is from, I started my education in Ghana. I have a bachelor's degree from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, where I studied communication design. And then from there, I graduated and I started working as a designer. And I rose from the ranks of a junior designer to a creative director until I left the country. I left Ghana in 2017. When I left in 2017, the idea was to pursue a master's as also as a means of taking a break from all the work that I've been doing, because I was like, well, it seems like I'm doing a lot of like, I feel like a tool, if that even makes sense. Like I feel like being a tool and all I'm doing is doing the same kind of thing every single day. So the plan was to try and take a break from that and pursue a master's degree where I can actually start to figure out like, what is my practice about? How do I define what my visual voice is, right? Because I like to believe that we all have our unique voices that we end up contributing to how the world feels like. Okay, so as far as my talk, this is a photo of my grandmother called Comfort Opoku. So Comfort Opoku is my mother's mother. And I think what's interesting about this photo is that this photo could literally represent 3 generations in my family. Like this is my grandmother when she used to work as a cook. And my mother also looks very similar to my grandmother, who also like cooks a lot. And so does my sister. So again, it's just interesting that one photograph can actually represent 3 generations of people at the same time. So as you might have been able to tell me from the talk, the title of the talk is For Comfort, right? And the talk is being dedicated to my grandma, who I think there's a story behind that also, the fact that when I was 3 years old, I was at a party that How Old Am I, when they sing that song that usually goes like, happy birthday to you, blah, blah, and how old are you, right? And I think with that, I think I was such in a hurry to grow up that instead of saying I was 3 years old, I actually said I was 30. And I think that was something that, I mean, it got the crowd going. Like they laughed about it. It was funny. But what stood out to me the most was that every single, like most of the time, every single year, my grandma would sort of like remind me about that. She'd be like, well, Jude, are you 30 yet? I'll say, no, I'm not. Are you 30 yet? I'm not. I'm not. And it just kept on going that way. But when I was 27, so okay, I think I'm gonna give off my age, but when I was 27, my grandma had asked me that question. I was like, you shouldn't worry about it. When I turn 30, I'll let her know and we'll actually have like a grand celebration because 10 and 30 is a big deal. So unfortunately, my grandmother actually ended up passing 3 days before I left Ghana, and I was like, well, she never got a chance to ask me again when I was 28 or when I was 29 or when I was 30. And it just turns out that I'm giving this talk when I'm actually 30. So again, I was like, this talk in a way should memorialize her memory in a sense that it's interesting to think about like how far I've come with the sense that it's not everyone that got to be here with me to hear me talk, right? So I think again, that's the part of the talk that basically resonates with my grandmother, where it's actually dedicated to her. So it's like for comfort, right? The other side of it is also to comfort is that again, like I said, my grandmother was a housekeeper. Like she really knew how to take care of people. She always make sure you're eating. And that same sort of like trait was translated to my mother, who also like took it to my sister. And I think, I mean, in the coming slides, I'll talk about how that even affected my practice also. But again, there's this whole idea about how do you care for someone, right? How do you even care for yourself? Because as far as like even like process of it, you'd have to care for yourself, right? Self-care is really important before you start to care for someone else. So again, most of my practice, I mean, that has evolved over the years has really been about how to care for people, how to get people talking about stuff, right? Because a big part of my practice also has to do with like language, my interest in language. So as that expanded, I mean, over the course of years, it then became this idea. I mean, I started thinking about, well, my practice can end up being something that focuses on having conversations, right? Because personally for me, like I'm a talker, like I like to talk when you get me going, when I'm in the mood, I talk and I can have a conversation for like an hour, right? So again, my practice tries to combine the idea of like language and conversation, right? How can I have conversation? How can we talk about certain topics that most people would not want to talk about, right? The other thing also is as a designer, being trained as a designer, I start to think about the several roles that we have as designers. And for me, I try to stay away or move away from this idea of like being a designer that is in the forefront that just like probably has the solutions to every problem, right? Because usually in the design school, you tell you, well, you need to figure out a solution to a particular problem. And that's basically how it goes, right? But for me, I think it extends much more than that with the idea that you need to figure out what your role is in society as a designer also, or like even every aspect of life that you find yourself in. And for me, it's more about trying to figure out how I can be a mediator, right? A mediator where I can basically help people have some of these conversations. I can facilitate conversations, have them talking about issues that they find really hard to have conversations about. Okay, so I mean, with that said, at least now I hope I've given each one of you like an idea of like what the talk will be about. So at least you can know what to expect. Okay, so the first project I want to talk about is That's What She Said. And like Aggie also said in the introduction, my practice tries to like also deal with like different kind of media from artist books. I also do like installations. So for this first project, it's a book, it's a handmade book that I made and I titled it That's What She Said. And that's what she said again. I mean, it goes to that idea of like humor or the joke that basically surrounds that word of like, that's how she said. So in this particular project, I started focusing on the idea about, I wanted to talk about what independence meant to Ghana, right? Being from Ghana, I want to talk about what independence meant to Ghana. And I think it was pretty hard to have that conversation because some people have like a very traumatic relation to the struggle for independence, how we gain independence. And I think for me, it was about how do I create a conducive environment or a safe space for us to have a conversation about it. So with that being said, I mean, this video on here, so there's a video I'm going to play very shortly, but this is Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and the Big Six, who basically were the ones that led the struggle towards independence for Ghana. And I'm just going to play a video very quickly, so at least we can listen to what they are saying in the video. But
The battle has ended. And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever.
So that's a speech that was delivered by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who ended up being like the first prime minister of Ghana after gaining independence. And Ghana is the first country to actually gain independence in Africa. And Ghana has most of the time been referred to as the gateway to Africa, again, from the sense of like we gained independence first, and how the idea of like, I mean, how Europeans basically came to Africa, right? It was basically connected through Ghana, which back then was called the Gold Coast. So again, the idea here was that, I mean, most people know about Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, right? For his struggle, his fight, I mean, his connections to even to Martin Luther King. But there's a side of him that, I mean, most of the side that often they know is like being like a civil activist. And the fact that he always like is serious, he comes across as very like, he knows exactly what he's talking about. But what I wanted to do in this case is that I wanted to take a very well-known speech, which I think I just put an excerpt from, a very well-known speech, right? And then start to think about how can I change the sequence, which would in turn change the narrative of the story, right? Because then again, I mean, people have several like perceptions that they have about like Ghana or Africa, you know, and again, it's like, it all comes from a particular narrative, right? But then again, it's like, how do you change that narrative as something as simple as sequence? So on the left is an image of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah basically giving a speech. And then on the right is when what I did was I took the independence speech that he delivered on the 6th of March, 1957, which is when Ghana gained independence. I took that speech, and what I did was I tried to highlight a few parts, a few sentences of that speech, and then just rearranged it, right? Rearrange it, try and see what kind of story that I want to tell. And with that being said, what I ended up finding out about that, like trying to think about the sequence, was that it came to me that, well, instead of showing the very serious side of Kwame Nkrumah, I also want to show the more jovial, right, aspect of him that actually relates to his wife, right? So again, the idea here was to change the narrative that basically also tells a story of like Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and his wife Fatia after he gave that independence speech, right? So again, it's like the speech was had. I mean, he gave the speech. Everyone knows that Ghanaians were happy, we rejoiced. That was great. But then I want to tell a story about like when he left, right, and he went home. What actually happened between him and his wife when they went home, especially, I mean, specifically in the bedroom. So, I mean, on the left, you start to see, I start to make these cards where I start to like section off parts of the independence speech and start to like think about how can I change sequence? How can I start to tell a story in this same sense? So in that sense, what I ended up making was I ended up making this letterpress bound book. But a few things that I also ended up using in there is that I used the wooden type U as an abstract shape to also help me as a visual metaphor to help me explain, I mean, or tell the narrative in a better way. So what you end up also seeing also in here is that the book in itself also there's a part of it that also like has to do with like that has to do with the form of the book in itself, where it was bound that it never would lay flat, right? Anytime you open up the book, so I probably have the book here if you can see me, but this is how the book sits, right? No matter how much you open it, it will never lay flat. And the idea there about that is that I wanted to also highlight the idea of like the arousal stage of a man to when he finally climaxes, right? From arousal, I mean, whatever happens, and then he climaxes, right? So again, the interesting thing about the book is, which I've tried to capture in these like 4 images from top left, is the top left is actually where the book starts, right? When we start opening it up. When you open it up, it means like I mean, he's basically getting aroused at that point. And then when he stands, I mean, the second image of the top right is when he's fully aroused, right? Standing at a like 90-degree angle. And then from that point until like he finally climaxes, which is the last image at the bottom right. But then the other thing also about that was that the image, what really helped the book like be also interesting in that same sense was that the image of the image of the U basically could be used as different forms, right? Again, thinking about like type as image, right? It really comes into that place in the same way, because I mean, some of the few images that you also end up seeing on here, you start to see that the U can end up being like a magnet, which draws certain words in. It could end up being like a condom. It could end up being like the feet to a bed, right? So for example, like this particular spread on here basically is still the U, but then the placement, right, of the U on the spread ends up telling a story, right? And then you have, I have some text on there that basically puts the idea of like what happens when people are having sex on the bed when it's moving. So it's like the choco choco choco, the squeaking sound that the bed actually makes in that instance. I think it's something that I also wanted to highlight in there because again, a big part of this project was thinking about humor, right? How do I bring humor into a situation like this that it'll get people to feel relaxed, open up, and actually want to have a conversation about things that led up to Ghana gaining independence. And this particular spread also that I also highlight here also, it starts also to do the same thing where again, every text that's actually on, apart from the thumb and the squeak, right? Everything on there is actually from the original independence speech. I did not change a word. I did not flip anything. The only thing I did was I just changed the sequence, right? So for example, if you look at the current spread I have on right now, which basically reads as, I can see that you came in your millions, right? This ended up being the last spread of the book, right? Which ends up being the one at the bottom right? Which again represents climax, but then it has nothing to do with climax in real life because it was actually talking about the fact that, from the video we watched, there were millions of Ghanaians that gathered that day to basically celebrate our independence. But again, the idea of changing a narrative was also something to take note of. So, with this project, the idea was that once you experience the book, if you have the chance to experience the book, you hopefully burst out into laughter and laugh about it and think it's a really interesting thing. And then with that, when that happens, it basically sort of like lets your guard down. You feel more relaxed, you feel more open to want to have a conversation about a few things. So that was a tool that I basically used to help people have a conversation about events leading up to independence in a way that I can basically ease tension and then facilitate conversation. The next project I want to talk about is My Name is Ghana. So again, this project also was a handmade book, letterpress book. But then what's interesting about this project also is the fact that when I had moved to the US to do my master's, there was this whole idea about like wanting to go back home, what it means to go back home. Would you be accepted? Would you be seen the same way? Do you sound different? All that. And I think it's a struggle that a lot of people who've left like their own countries and like different parts of the world still end up facing, right? It's like, how can we have a very solid conversation about some of these things, right? And I think in the same way I did the previous project, which was That's What She Said, I was like, well, what does that mean if that also gets translated to a different book? So again, the idea here for this particular project or this particular book was that I wanted to make a book that literally personified Ghana, right? Ghana is usually called Mother Ghana because of the fact that, because of the shape of the map of Ghana, it feels like it has like a bulging shape in the front, which symbolizes that it's pregnant. Like Ghana is pregnant, she's pregnant, right? So again, we call her like Ghana is often referred to as a mother. So there's this idea about personification. So pushing that idea of personification, how can I basically make a book that in a way, sort of like it's like a mother speaking to her kids or her children, which are basically the citizens of Ghana, right? But in this case, it was specifically targeting or talking to Ghanaians who had left the country, right, and wanted to return, right? So I think that was the idea here with this particular book when it was done. So again, there are a few key things that I use in this book to try to like also help us think about memory, right? So again, it's like when you leave home, like for me, I think a lot about food. Like food is a big thing on my mind all the time. But again, it's like, what are certain things, key elements that people can start to think about that will make them want to miss home, right? So again, the biggest part of that was thinking about the map of Ghana being the first thing. The other thing was also thinking about the fabric, right? The fabric that we as Ghanaians also have that we hold dear to our culture was also the other thing I also wanted to bring into this. Okay, so you'd see, on a part of the book is, this is the first spread when you open up the book, which again, I end up using the fabric, which for me was this idea about how can I basically have people start thinking about or start missing home or wanting to like have a conversation about home, right? Because then again, just showing this fabric, it definitely opens it up to several conversations that could be had in that instance, right? So with that being said, I needed content, like I clearly needed content to make this book. And I did some research and I found this amazing poem by Nketia, who's a wonderful poet also. The title of the poem is My Name is Ghana, right? So what I did in that same instance, as I did with the previous project, was I took excerpts from that poem and basically made it into a book, right? So the way the book is set up is that the book is divided into two parts. The first part of it being that it is Ghana again addressing her kids, like someone like me, having a conversation about, well, I know this is why you left. That's the first part of the book, which basically talks about Ghana understanding, or Mother Ghana understanding why her kids leave the country. And the second part of the book basically talks about Ghana trying to convince her kids to come back, right? So in that instance, let's talk about food, culture, music, dance, stuff like that, to try to have you think about what you're missing, what you've lost, sort of like lost, and try to like bring it back into the country. So a big part of that also is Edinkra signs or Edinkra symbols. So Edinkra symbols, I'm sure like a lot of people have come across that because it's also at some point in time now, has been a symbol that also like represents a connection between like African Americans or everyone who has left African continent to come back to Ghana. To come back to Africa. So again, that was something I also wanted to use here in that same sense, where it's like, well, I'm going to use these Edinkra symbols because all these Edinkra symbols basically mean something, right? And the word Edinkra, which literally translates to farewell, to bid someone farewell. So again, it was very fit for the kind of like content of book that I was actually working on. Because again, it's the idea about to bid someone farewell, but then also how do you invite them to come back in, right? So with that in mind, the book is set up in such a way that every spread has an Edinkra symbol and then an excerpt from the poem that basically connects to that, right? So for example, this image I'm showing here basically says that it was talking about Ghana basically reminding Ghanaian citizens who've left the country about the fact that being thrown out of voyaging ships by migrant merchants in the name of seeking greener pastures, right? So again, this idea about calling out to them and talking about, well, this is where you want to actually go through. This is where you can actually go when you come back home, right? Because home is home. There's this account saying that if right? It basically translates to like home is home, where it's like you never feel at peace only if you're at home, right? So again, this whole idea about how do you get people to come back home in that same sense. So like I was saying, this is the center spread of the book, which again has like a pattern of like these Edinkra symbols that again connotes or like have you really thinking about home, really missing home and wanting to go back. So then when it gets to the second part of the book, again, it's basically Ghana reaching out and calling out to their citizens, her citizens or her kids, saying that, well, come back home. And then it's a part of the poem that also, I couldn't show that in this image, but it's part of the poem that basically actually calls out the real kids of Ghana, where, for example, in Ghana, one of the things we do is that we are given day names. So for example, like my name is Jude Agboada. So the Yao is basically means that like I was born on a Thursday and a male. So if I was a woman, I would be Ya, right? So again, there's part of the book where Ghana basically calls out to her kids and says Brafie Ya, Brafie Kwame, Brafie Adjoa, right? And again, this whole idea about calling people to come back home, right? So again, that was the idea with this book where book was basically when it was made. I made a few copies. I think I made like 10 copies, and then I distributed a few of them to people that also like lived out here, outside Africa. And let's just figure out like what their reaction to that was. What kind of conversation can we have about that? Can we start like talk about our experiences living outside Ghana or living outside Africa? What does that mean to us? So again, there's this. So gradually, I'm starting to like figure out like means or tools in which like I can actually get people to start having conversations about particular topics. And this was one of them, which was pretty dear to my because I also like I'm in the same instance or same position. Yeah. The next project I also want to talk about is Akwaba. So Akwaba is Twi, which translates to welcome. Yeah, so with this project, what I basically wanted to do again was I wanted to make an artist book that emphasized the idea of doors. Like, what if we had a portable door, right? So again, this artist book is thinking of the point of view of a portable door. Like, what does it mean if you can go through a door? Because again, for different cultures, a door is literally a transition from one place to another, right? So again, just walking through a door might seem very like a simple thing that we do on a day-to-day basis. But then again, like there's this different level of moving from one point to the other, right? So again, this particular artist book that I did named Akwaba was a point in my life where I wanted to also like try and reflect, right, on how far I've come or what I've been through and like how can that could also end up shaping up my practice. And the reason why I ended up using these same Edinkra symbols is because like there's this particular Edinkra symbol called Sankofa, which also literally translates the idea of like going back, right? The idea of like reflection. So the point of this book was I wanted to highlight certain doors that I've passed through or gone through, right? As far as like these areas in my life where I feel like I've crossed or I was able to like get through at a point where I did not, I feel like I really wanted to highlight. So again, there were 10 doors because the number 10 means a lot to me. This is personally. So I ended up making these 10 doors, and then each door had a particular like a decor symbol that went with it. Again, thinking about the idea of like what that symbol also means or what it connotes, right? Because again, when I reflect back and think about it, the idea of like going through these 10 doors, every single door that I went through taught me a lesson. Like I learned something from it, right? Because again, this whole idea about even waking up each day is a blessing, right? And I think it's good that we can also have time to also like look back and reflect on some of these things when they happen. So I'm going to quickly just skip and go to this video that basically shows, this video shows someone actually trying to like open the book. One thing you notice, hopefully you can hear this as I'm still talking, is the fact that, it's the fact that it seems pretty difficult to open the door, right? Which again is a metaphor for life, right? The struggles of life. And then the reason why the doors are basically on the left and the right is the fact that life literally does that, right? Life will definitely hit you from the left and the right, sometimes from the top and even at the bottom, right? All that happens. But then again, thinking about how can I represent, right, or summarize my life. I haven't lived a long life yet, but I mean, how can I summarize my life in such a way that it feels like it can be in a portable sense, right? Where it could always even end up being on my desk or my table, where from time to time I could just pick it up, look at it, reflect, and think about, well, okay, I started from this point, point A, now my point B, right? So I think it was just as a reminder to figure out like where I'm at. So a few things you notice in the artist book whilst it's being open is that each door has a particular name attached to it, right? Which again had a reference to what I was naming these doors. Because then again, I mean, I believe a lot in the fact that naming is really important. Like how you name someone could definitely end up influencing their life and how they live. So that was the point of that. So what you notice is that, I mean, the doors, each of them has a name. And then once you're able to go through all 10 doors, what happens is that you land on this little, like this mini book that is supposed to be like a reward, right, of a reflection. And within that book, you'd find, I mean, this is the book that basically, after you go through the 10 doors, which is basically like a reminder, which contains some of these like sort of like very short poems, like writings that basically are sort of like an encouragement, right? To encourage you as far as like how far you've been. So for example, this one on here says, the name of the door was Amofa, which I mean, the quote that goes on there is the fact that that's the old and wise one. You said nothing. Your form spoke volumes, right? So again, it's one as a reflection, but two as a way to also encourage me to also like think about, well, you've come this far, and it's always good to reflect, right? I think that's a big part of this particular project about a bit of reflection, going back. How do I think about what's next? Because again, like I said, every day we wake up, I feel like it's definitely a blessing in that same sense. Okay. The other project I'm going to talk about is Myths of Life. So Myths of Life basically is a project that I wanted to think about in a sense of my childhood, like being raised up, right? So, and I think this applies to several cultures. Like many cultures also have this, where our parents or older generation will tell us certain myths about certain things we should not do, which end up having like a consequence to it, right? So for example, I think in the US, it's like, don't step on a crack or you break your mother's back. I think that's the one I know about in the US. But back at home, we have ones like, do not sing whilst you're in the shower, or else your mom will drop dead, right? Something like that. I mean, the analogy of that, it's a really interesting like myth in itself, where it's like, well, there's no way you'd actually like sing in the shower and like your mom actually drop dead, because again, it's something I tried and it never worked out, but again, if you think about it in that sense, it's like, for a fact, I mean, as a kid, right, you don't really think about it happening because you're so scared about it happening, you actually would not do it, right? But then again, there's like this moral approach to it, right, where our parents or the older generation did not want us to do certain things that would end up harming us. So they actually ended up framing that in a form of a myth, right? But what was crazy about it is the fact that the consequences always ended up being something very absurd, like very crazy, like something that you'd never actually think about, right? So for example, like I said, if you sing in the shower, your mom will drop dead. like there's several ones. There's this other one which says that if you leave water out for throughout the night and you wash it with your face, right, you see ghosts at night, right? So again, you think about it, it's like, this thing is actually crazy. I would not want to do. I don't want to see ghosts, right? I don't want my mom to die, so you would not do it. So again, there's this like moral behind it where it actually gets you to monitor your behavior, right? So again, there's a part about behavior, monitoring behavior, right? How do you get someone to change their behavior or to adjust their behavior in that same sense? So again, I took that ideology and so like tried to make a card game, right? A card game which was directed at parents, right? Not just parents also, but also I thought about how can this be replicated in an office space, right? So for example, I mean, everyone who's ended working in an office space at a point in time, whether an internship, actually working right now, colleague, you always have someone who's annoying, right? Someone who ends up like eating your food, someone who ends up talking too much, someone who ends up chewing too loud. So again, it's like, how can we think about creating these myths that would help address that? But a big part of that also was me thinking about, well, they were effective before because they were at a point where we were kids, right? Kids were very vulnerable, we're very naive. We didn't know any better, so we believed them. So again, it's like, how does this play out when it comes to a point of view where it's like an office, where it's like adults actually working? Well, adults end up believing some of these things. So what I had ended up doing was at the time I was in grad school and I did this project and at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I used to work at the Writing Center. And one of the things I was able to do was I was able to like monitor, the affairs of how things were being run in the Writing Center I was an admin at the time. And one of the things I was interested in doing was, or thinking about was, are there certain things that people are doing within this office or this space that annoy you or you actually want someone to stop, right? So again, the idea was that you basically pose something that you want someone to stop doing. So for example, that I'm showing on here, it says, don't write passive aggressive emails, right? And then your consequence has to be absurd, something that's really brutal or very crazy, something someone would never actually like wish for or think about, right? So again, for example, in this case, it ended up being, don't write passive aggressive emails or else a clan will burn down your home, which is pretty brutal, right? It's like, well, I probably would not write those kind of emails then. I would not do that, right? So again, it's and the one in the background, you can't really see that, but then again, it's like, there's a consequence on that basically says that your nose would fall off, right? So again, it's like, how do you think about something that you want someone to stop doing? So for example, in an office space, maybe someone ends up taking your food from the fridge, right? Without asking you, even when you have a name on it, right? So with something like that, maybe you can also like make up a consequence that's very like absurd with the fact that they could eat it and then they could literally like drop dead, right? Again, it's this whole idea about how can you figure out like or think about the most absurd thing that would actually get them thinking in that same way. So again, this is an image of like when most of these were filled out. So I basically let one of my coworkers at the time fill most of these out just to talk about like a few things that she found that was really upsetting or like annoying to her that was happening within that space. So when it was done and we wrote, it was all done and we wrote, she did a couple of them. It was more than that, but she wrote a couple of them. What happened was I basically just posted them onto the wall and just had people reading it once they came in. So this was actually strategically placed just next to the elevator, right? So it's like when you come out of the elevator and you just walk into the hallway, it's the first thing you end up seeing and looking at. So you would read it. So it's almost as if it's like these are the rules that basically govern this land, right? The land being the working space. And then people had several reactions to it. People thought it was like just funny. Some people took it serious. But then again, it was interesting to just try and measure, right? How do you measure how the impact of something like that? Like, was it helpful? Did it work out? Did it not work out? I think it was something for us to rethink about in that sense. But again, because it was a really short experiment that I run, it only lasted for about, I think it was only up for about maybe 3 days or maybe a week, like 5 days. But again, going back and speaking to my colleague at the time, I think a few things I would ask was that had they noticed that a few things had stopped, right? And one of the things that they had on there was the fact that people were taking pens and not returning them. But then some way, somehow, after this had been hanging up for about 5 days, they noticed that, well, people, they don't lose pens as much, right? And again, I think with that idea, it was like, well, it might not be as effective as it would be with kids, but then to a certain point, this idea about you can still influence someone's behavior of course, a behavioral change by just doing just this little like this little action in that same sense. So I think ideally with this project, what I'm hoping, I mean, it's something that I'm still working on, but I'm hoping that it ends up being like a card game that parents can play, where they can basically even exchange some of these myths across like different households that can also help them in raising their kids, right? Because again, I mean, it really works very well on kids. It worked on me, and I'm sure it worked on a lot of people also in the audience right now. But yeah, the next project I also want to talk about is Collected, which was a very quick project that I worked on when I was in grad school, which I mean tries to highlight my love for language. Like I'm really interested in language. I admire poets a lot, poets, writers a lot. And with this project, what I was asked to do was, I mean, every year with a graduating class, their work is sort of like put together, collated, and put together into a book, a publication, which is called Collected. Again, the name Collected, to collect. So the idea here was, how do I end up making a book that also like visualize the particular theme, right? That they wanted to like go for that particular year. So this is basically like an example of some of the pages that I did for that particular project. So I'll just quickly just probably just skip through some of these. But then again, it was like thinking also a lot about like space. How do I use space? How then do you also give voice to a poet or a writer, right? Because then again, a big part of like writing or being a poet is like it's the word, right? It's a written word, right? How do you give it some sort of like power to be able to like impact or influence people in different ways? Like how does that feel? How is that being read, right? So again, this goes as far as like thinking about how do you set type, how do you think about space, printing, letting, all that. But then again, for me, the biggest part of that was how can I take someone's written word, right, and let it actually have a particular impact to people, right? Because I believe that there's so much power within languages, which again, like I said, is why I'm really interested in like the idea of languages also. But yeah, I'll just flip through a few of these pages. The other project I want to talk about, so I feel like I'm probably skimming through a few of these projects, but I think hopefully at the end, they'll all like connect and make sense. But the other project I want to talk about also is Tamped, which is a project that I worked on with my very dear friend Ama Asantua Diaka, which basically tries to also like highlight work that's coming from Africa, right? And because I think that's a really important thing, because again, it's like I said, there's this idea or like this, I'm really drawn to this idea about how do you give voice, right, to someone, right, who feels like they cannot be heard? How do you highlight certain things that are being done in particular parts of the world, especially Africa? And I think the team at Tamped are doing a really great job as far as like bringing artists together where you can celebrate their work. It could be like visual work, it could be like poems, it could be writings, it could be like design, it could be photography. But then again, it's like, how do you highlight some of these works and put them out there? So, I mean, just going through some of these few projects that I've worked on, I mean, it starts to have me thinking really a lot about like, what does it mean, right? Like, what role do I play as a designer? Like in some of these projects, like I said, where I end up moving from working from a creative agency to actually transition to this idea about, well, I don't want to be the regular like designer, graphic designer, where all I do is like work on certain brands, advertising, make money, all of that, right? But it's like, well, I feel like I actually want to do projects that I can actually measure the impact of it, right? So for example, something like simple as this, giving a voice to like poets or artists, I think it's really important. And I think for me, it's what basically is of a lot of importance to me. Okay. So the other project another project I want to talk about also is when elephants fight. So there's this African proverb that goes that when elephants fight, it's the ground that suffers, right? Which translates to the fact that I move to think of the size of an elephant. When an elephant's like is to fight or even jump, even if it can't jump. But if an elephant's fight, it's the ground that ends up suffering or the grass that ends up suffering. So again, I was taking this from the very political point of view, right? With the fact that I was highlighting two very key people in Ghana, Ghana politics, or even in the history of Ghana. Being so, the one on the left is Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who hopefully I introduced in the beginning, who was basically the chief catalyst in Ghana gaining independence. And then next to him is sorry, next to him is the second person who ended up ruling after him through a coup, right? There was a coup that was basically done to take him off because there was this conversation that was had where it felt like Nkrumah wanted to be a dictator, right? Because again, when you think about it, I mean, he's a great man. He did really great stuff. But then again, it got to a point where I felt like he felt the responsibility that he was the one who helped Ghana gain independence. So it's like, well, he's the only one who has the vision, right? So again, we talk about, I mean, this can also like open it up to conversation about the dangers of like looking at things from only one point of view, right? It's like if you're looking at things from only one point of view, it's really limiting, right? Because again, there are like multiple perspectives to start to think about things from. So there's a video here that I'm going to try and play. Oh, okay, that video isn't played, but hopefully I'll try and come back to it. Okay. The other project I'm going to talk about also very quickly is White Lines. So White Lines is a project that I did when I was in Chicago, and also in grad school, where I came across this particular church. That was on the south side of Chicago, which was literally in the center of Woodlawn. And Woodlawn is it's an African American dominated community. But then what's interesting about the church is that I mean, at the time that I came across it, it was largely attended by white people, right? You know, this sense of the fact that people in the community, like, I mean, residents in the community did not want to attend the church, like did not feel comfortable going in because of the fact that it felt like it did not represent them, right? Because again, if you think about it, the neighborhood in itself, the population of it is very like African American dominated. And then you have people coming in from a different neighborhood to attend that church where it's like they call it their own, right? So again, there was this sort of like disconnect between a church and its residents, right? And I give think about it, a church is supposed to be a welcoming body that allows everyone to come in. Yeah. Okay. So what I wanted to do in this particular project was I ended up like interviewing people, the residents in the neighborhood, and started asking them how they felt about this disconnect between them and the church, because they felt like the church was not for them, which the church should be, because the church, again, should be a very non-biased institution that like accepts everyone, right? So again, that was like of interest to me a lot, and I really wanted to like pursue this idea about thinking about what does it mean, right, when a church feels disconnected from a community, right? And again, a big part of like African American community is that, I mean, a pillar of African American community is a church, right? If you think about it through history, right? A church is the thing that signifies or like really holds a lot of power as far as an African American community. So again, seeing this happening, I think it was something that was really strange to me. So I really wanted to address it. So what I did in this instance was I basically interviewed some of the residents, asked them how they were feeling about this particular situation, and I tried to also talk to some of the officials in the church, trying to figure out like where the disconnect was also coming from. And I think what was interesting about this project was that it was something as simple as a conversation between the two bodies had not happened, right? The church hadn't spoken to the residents hadn't spoken to the church. So again, what I wanted to do in that case again was to be a mediator, where I basically used the facade of the church as like a board, where I basically projected the thoughts of the community. Also projected history about the church, why it happens to be the way that it is right now. So the images I'm basically showing right now are images that I was just testing out to see how basically light interacts with an architectural structure, right? Or even like with the material. How does that also like feel also? And I think it was interesting also in that same sense, where I was also thinking about the feelings, or how do I also express the emotions of people within the community. So what I wanted to do, with that project was I wanted to really think about the materiality of like the building, the facade of the structure, and then think about how can I start to like project some of these emotions or feelings of the residents, and then also like sort of like superimpose that also on like what the church actually is also saying about all these things, right? How can we have a conversation in that same sense? So based on this diagram here, what I ended up doing was, luckily for me, through research, I found out that the church was actually historically dominated by the Germans, the Irish, and the English people. And lucky for me, like I said, there were 3 doors in front of the church. I was like, well, that's perfect. I'm just going to basically label these doors with these 3 different groups of people. And then there's a quote underneath there that I think is a quote from Jesus Christ. Making reference to the church. He spoke about the fact that he came not for the saved, but they're unsaved, right? Which is the idea about like opening up to everyone, like, right? So in that idea, the idea here was that I wanted to like, one, show history to the residents, and two, also show how the residents also felt about the church, right? So what I ended up doing was I ended up projecting portraits of African-American people into a particular facade of the building, where you notice that in this particular image, the glass part of the building is also like it's translucent, which means that it would retain light and also like reflect light, which again gives it this. So it ended up being like a metaphor for how the people felt, right? They felt like they were there in the neighborhood, but then they were not being represented, which was something they wanted me to get across. So, with that projection being done, this is a photograph of the projection, and you can see the tiny projector there that basically was a short little projector, which is great, which I ended up projecting onto the facade of this huge structure, this church, where again, like I said, I projected the labels of the names, like the Irish people, German people, English people, and then there was a code also underneath there. You'd also notice that within the arch of the church, the glass side of it, I basically projected lights in there to give this impression that church was in service. Yes, church was in service. So it felt like people actually in there, where it's like only these 3 people were allowed to come in, right? Again, if you think about it, it actually has a connection to thinking about racism in America, right? This idea about, before, a lot of these places were labeled as like whites only, and then there's a particular part that says for colored people only, right? So again, this idea about labeling, right? How does that also come to play in this instance? So this is a short video that basically, hopefully you get a sense of the various images that were being projected into that space, and you get to see also how when an image is projected into that space, it's like you can see it, you cannot see it, which again, like I was saying, basically represents how the residents of the neighborhood also felt as far as like their representation within the community. So this was done on a cold night in Chicago, and Chicago gets cold. So it was like a very like one-stop, like one-time guerrilla situation where it's like I just do it once and just like pack up my project and just like head off. But it was, again, like I said, it was freezing. But I think what was interesting about that was whilst this projection was happening, we had residents driving by and wondering like what was happening, right? So they would you probably see a car just go by, but as cars went by, they would stop, get out of their car and come out, and then we would have a conversation after they've like had a chance to also like look at what's going on there. But so there's no sound in this video, but if you can probably see me, I'm at the top left corner there, basically explaining my research that I've done about the church to people that stop, right? So again, this idea about having to explain to them the fact that the church actually isn't racist. This particular church isn't actually racist. It's just the fact that they actually are open to everyone coming in, but because of the fact that we've not had a conversation, it prevents them from actually coming in. And I think from that point on, I haven't been to that church in probably like 2 or 3 years now. So, but from the last I heard, people, like the rest of the community actually attending the church a bit more. So again, for me, it was a way for me to also like measure the success or the impact that a project as simple as just projecting images onto a particular facade would actually impact a particular group of people. Okay, so the last project I want to talk about is independence, which again circles back to my roots, which is the fact that like I'm Ghanaian. And I want to talk about this idea about, colonialism, what colonialism means, or how even architecture. So this basically came out of my thesis project in grad school, which was centered around the fact that how does architecture act as a tool of colonialism in post-colonial states, right? Like how does architecture also affect that, or how do post-colonial states deal with like a colonial architecture, right? And using Ghana as a case study, again, with the fact that Ghana was the first to gain independence, what I wanted to do in this case was I really wanted to like analyze or critically look at the Black Star Gate. So the Black Star Gate is a monument that sits, it's in the center, it's in Accra, which is the capital city of Ghana, which was commissioned by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, and was built to be a symbol of our independence or our freedom, right? But then what's interesting about this particular monument is the fact that its location, right? The monument in itself has a really dark past, right? Apart from the fact that it's a very neoclassical architecture, which has nothing to do with like the Ghanaian culture, right? it also has like a really dark past that I really wanted to also like unveil, like bring to light for people to have conversations about, right? Because again, I mean, a part of history that I also came across with the fact that the monuments being built was actually the first step of Ghana being in debt to foreign aid, right? Because we had to borrow money to build that monument. It cost so much money, but again, it's like they actually ended up putting us into debt. So again, it's like, how does a monument or a structure that's supposed to represent our independence ended up being the thing that actually gets us into debt, right? So I think that was something I wanted to discuss also in there. But again, just to show this image, what I wanted to show on here is that if you look at where the Black Star Gate is placed, which is the red arrow, there are two red arrows there, but the red arrow on the right, is situated literally a few meters from the coast, which is the same coast in which slaves were taken from, or people were taken from Ghana to the west, right? Because the other arrow that's on the red one is the Osu Castle, which was a fort for slaves, where slaves were basically kept and then shipped off to the west. So again, I was thinking a lot about like, what is this relationship also happening here? Like, what is there to think about with this idea of like having the fort being where it is, and also like this monument also being seated where it was. And another thing that I found also really interesting is that like, so this is an image of the of the Black Star Gate. When it's like this image on here, you see it's at a roundabout, right? If you're able to go around it, right, the different views of it end up presenting very interesting perspectives to it, right? To a point where if you stand at it's probably like a 3/4, a 45-degree angle from it, you start to see that it almost feels like they are like the columns end up representing prison bars, which again was something I really wanted to highlight to tell this like story, this narrative about how things were being seen. So again, this is basically an image of like a few of the sketches that I made and fell into marketing style, wanting to like think about how can I change the form of the monument, right? So in that case, what I wanted to do is I basically literally ended up introducing two columns in the middle, right? So this is the original, how it looks. It only has like two columns in the middle of, but then I ended up adding an additional two columns, which end up representing or giving a sense of like prison, right? Like a prison bar, like, the idea of like bondage, right? Because again, like I said, this monument sits literally close to the coast, right? This same coast was where, like I said, slaves were taken off the continent. And I think it was interesting because if you think about it, the idea of like the prison bars was the thing that actually created a disconnect between people that left Ghana or Africa and back at home in Africa, right? So it was almost as if like there's this, and I think it was also crazy about the fact that it's called a Black Star Gate, right? It's a gate, like a gateway where people were taking, like, if you think about it, the people went through that gate and never came back. But then it's like now, with things happening, I think they're trying to like get back to how they used to be. But again, I really want to highlight this idea about how this monument that really did not fit within the society of Ghana was something we want to talk about and think about. How do we think about even like maybe redesigning the monument or repurposing the monument? Like, how does that also like become a conversation that we can also end up having? So I took that idea and started like making 3D models, thinking about, well, how can I structure this in a way that I can start to have a conversation about it? Because I wanted to show this. This was was shown in a gallery space in Chicago, where I just think about scale, because again, it's a monument. It's huge. Like it's a huge monument in the sense that like, how do I bring that idea of scale into a gallery space, right? So what I wanted to do in this case was, again, with the addition of those two columns to represent the idea of bondage, the other part of it I was also like thinking about also is the fact that due to colonialism, like most former colonial states, right, still struggle with this idea about trying to imitate the West and take on their own culture, right? It's like a push and pull. There's this tension happening in between there, right? So with the monument, what I wanted to do was that I wanted to basically build it or make it in such a way that it felt like it was in a wall, right? Where that wall basically was supposed to represent or be a metaphor for the idea of like this tension that happens between two countries or two continents, right? Where it's like post-colonial states are now trying to like take back their culture, but then also it's like they already have been forced through colonialism and conditioning to take up like Western culture, which is not their own, right? So again, it's like there's this tension happening in there. So what I did in that case was I literally like split the monument into half, like it was split into half, and then it was positioned in such a way that it was on a wall. So this is the final monument that sits that's set in the gallery space, which was, I think it was about 15 feet wide and maybe 9 feet high. So it was definitely taller than I am. But yeah, so again, there were three aspects to this project, where one of them was that I wanted to use sound as a medium to have people really thinking about a few things. So if you were to walk into the gallery space and you were to approach this monument, what you end up hearing sounds of a boat rowing, like boats being rowed on a ship, right? Or like water hitting a particular boat where it creates that splashing sound. And then the other part, the second part of it also was like the projection itself, right? So what I did was I basically projected an image of the ocean, which is, again, like I said, it's close to the actual monument and where the monument sits in Accra. I projected that image, so it gives like this idea of like, we're thinking about this in perspective and in reference to how things were or how things are in Ghana. And then the third part of it also was the monument itself, the structure, right? So again, these three levels, my hope for the project was that if at least you're not able to like connect to one aspect of it, another aspect of it will connect to you, right? But the other part, I mean, a big part that I also had to like wrestle with, or it was a challenge to me, was the fact that I was basically showing this project in a place that was not home, that was not Ghana, right? So again, it's like, how do you get people to have a conversation about something that they probably have no idea about, right? So again, it's like this idea about how do you also create awareness. But I think what struck me and was really interesting to me was that in the making of this project, a lot of people were able to still connect with it, right? With this idea about colonialism, bondage, because I even had like a colleague who was from Cuba who also spoke about their own connection with the monument. I had a few colleagues also from India that spoke about the fact that there's also like an Indian gate, which also seems to be seen in a similar manner because of the fact that, I mean, both countries were actually colonized by the British. So again, I think I'm not surprised that happens, but I think it was interesting to see that, I mean, every form of like, I mean, with the project itself, people were able to like find their own connections to it, right? People like would end up probably bringing their own like experiences to it also in that same sense. At the bottom there basically sits a placard, right? It's a placard that, well, one, I use it to basically house my projector, but the other part of it was that it was a placard that basically sort of like gave context to what the monument was, which I literally just read that this is a monument that's supposed to basically represent a country's independence, but then we are steeped in debt. So yeah, it's like we're actually not independent. So again, with this project, I mean, from the title, what I did was I did some word play on the title, which was the fact that I was saying that I was highlighting the fact that we're actually not independent, right? That we are actually in and we are dependent still on foreign aid, or sometimes actually going for the title of the project. So this is a short video of like, I mean, a view from interacting with a project.
You've been gone, it's an empty home. Come on back where you really belong. You are always welcome home, welcome home. You've been kept down for much too long. Stand up, please, and say I am free. Don't forget you are welcome home, welcome home.
Yep. So that basically was like a quick view to, I mean, that expresses how the monument was basically situated within the gallery space. The song you heard was a song by a band named Osibisa that were very popular also during this time, where they made songs that really highlighted the feelings of Ghanaians, which I felt was, I just used that for the video, but with the actual, I mean, in the gallery space, that was not a song playing. The song, like I said, was a sound of like a boat or a ship being rowed, which again highlighted this idea about when slaves were basically being moved from the African continent to the West. Yeah, so I mean, this is the last project I'm talking about, but I think something else I want to highlight also, or bring, that is a part of the project that I'm still working on, because this project is an ongoing project, is I really want to highlight this idea about community building within the African continent, or within Ghana, because a Ghanaian culture, even an African culture, is this idea about community, right? Because for me, even growing up, it's like we're literally raised by everyone in your community. Like everyone knows in the community. If people don't see you for a couple of days, they would actually come and ask your parents where you are. And I think that was something that we end up missing, or like it's sort of like getting lost, like with this whole idea of like we I mean, as Africans trying to like adopt this very Western culture that is, again, it's not our own. So for me, the hope of this is that the project becomes a project where we can start to like rethink, right? I'm starting to actually gather ideas from like fellow Ghanaians or Africans thinking about, well, what does a monument mean, right? How do we represent our independence in the country, in a sense that what kind of structure can we use to represent our independence, right? It's like, what's the thing from our own culture that can represent us, which definitely is not a new classic or European architectural style, right? So hopefully, I mean, I doubt the monument will ever get like put down, but I think for me, what's interesting to think about, even if it doesn't get destroyed or like it doesn't get pulled down, what happens if it's actually repurposed into something else, right? Like what, because with that structure, like, I mean, for people that have been there, have seen it, it's a huge structure. What if it's actually repurposed to be like sort of like a library or an archive that basically has photographs that represented, I mean, Ghana getting independence. Like, I mean, our fight for independence, it could actually end up being like a photo archive where it has photographs, videos being played within there. Because I mean, the only time this monument is actually used is on the 6th of March, where we have a parade in Ghana on the 6th of March every year where people march, and that's it. Aside that, it's like the monument really has no other use. Like it loses its functionality in that space, right? So for me, in the gallery space, when I had a chance to, I mean, dismantle, deinstall this project, I found that very like liberating, right? In a way that it was even like therapeutic for me, because I was like, well, even if this cannot really happen in real life, where the monument will be like either repurposed for something else, maybe I can start to do that now in my own way, where like now I was able to like build it up. Now I'm actually tearing it down, right? What does that feel like? What is the process of actually taking down something that's actually been there? So I mean, in the video that's on here, you basically just see me tear down like the monument, which again, hopefully it'll be something that we can actually start to think about. It's like, even if it's not tearing down the physical structure, how are we tearing down some of these like ideas or ideologies about like being colonized, right? What is like Western culture? How does Western culture basically come together or like connote or like relate to us as Ghanaians or as Africans? How can we start to like celebrate our own culture in that same sense? So I mean, once I took everything off, I mean, if you think about it again, going back to how this whole thing was set up, it basically leaves an empty space, right? Because even if the monument as it sits in Accra gets demolished, it will leave an empty space. It's like, what goes into that empty space? Which again is a question that I'm basically just asking to anyone. I mean, everyone out there, is that with the fact that if you want to dismantle something or tear something down, what replaces that, right? Because it's a conversation that actually needs to be had, right? Because it's like, if you're just going to tear something down, what's going to replace it or take its place? So I think that's an ongoing conversation I'm still having. I mean, with friends back at home, friends that live here, people that live from different countries that have also been colonized in the same way. What does that mean to them? And that, in the way that we can actually start to have a conversation that actually moves us forward and actually celebrates our culture, right? In that way. Okay, so I think this basically brings me to the end of my long ramble, I think. But yeah, that's basically at least a show of like a few of the projects that I've worked on for a couple of years now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jude. That was wonderful. That was great. Thank you. You ready for some Q&A?
Yeah. Hopefully I can catch my breath. Let's see.
Grabs a drink of water. As you say, stay hydrated, right?
Yeah, stay hydrated. That's important.
Well, there is one question that's in the chat now. While you catch your breath, might like me to annotate that or read that out loud?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. All right, here we go. So Samantha asks, it seems to me that you view a lot of your work as tools to change behavior or encourage discussion. I think this is such an interesting perspective that you bring as an artist and a designer. I wonder if you've ever made changes to your work after you've seen how people interact with it, kind of as an iterative sense, like a designer would. Are you excited by the possibilities that you didn't plan for, or driven to iterate until you produce a particular outcome? Great question, Samantha.
Yeah, this is an amazing question. I think it's really interesting to think about it in that sense where the idea about iteration, because I think about most of the projects that I worked on, because I was able to show today as being projects that are still ongoing, like they never end. Because I feel like with every project I've ended up working on, when people like interact with it or like give me feedback, it's like, well, there's never an end point to it, right? Because projects can keep going on. And I think it's the same way even as a designer, is that there's always something you can always add. There's always something you can always change, right? So again, I think for me, I have I have come to the understanding or decision. I made a decision that I don't want to be the person who has the solutions. Like I don't want to be the one. I don't want to celebrate myself and say, "Well, I have the answers. I have all the answers, right? I can fix some of these issues happening." But for me, it's more about I want to try and bring people together for us to have a conversation, right? Again, because it goes back to this whole idea about community building, right? Because I don't believe that we can like solve things on our own. You know, there's this saying that there's this Ghanaian saying that prior uyibakwe bu udiboma and bu, which literally translates the fact that if you take a broomstick as a single piece, it breaks easily. But then if it's put together and tied, it's very difficult to break that. So again, that's how I see it, right? Where it's like, for me, it's I just want to bring people together, have conversations about certain things because honestly, I really don't know a lot about certain stuff, and I just love having conversations with people also. So hopefully that answers your question, Samantha.
I'm so glad that Samantha asked that because I had a similar question in response to the project with the church, the White Lines project, and wondered if you would mind sharing what kinds of conversations did that facilitate with the community, and I wondered if the church responded at all.
Uh, yeah. Oh, okay.
Because
So I
that's
think what was interesting about that project was, and I would have loved to have the chance to really, to really document in the better form was the fact that I couldn't really stay. Like the only time I actually stayed to actually listen to people talk about it was when I was there explaining what I was doing, because unfortunately I was in a community that was being policed a lot by the cops, the police, and I was a black man holding like a projector with a case, standing there trying to like project something, opening stuff up. So again, I did not have the chance to actually like really stay there for long. And again, it was also cold. So for me, it was about when I stood there and I projected, it was me just sort of like opening up a conversation, which again, I think is what my practice really is about. Is about the idea of like, how do I facilitate these conversations? And I mean, a few things. I mean, the most rewarding part of that conversation that was had that night was the fact that an older lady who had been living in that neighborhood actually said that, oh, she actually never knew about most of these things. Like she had no idea this church had this history. So I think for me, I was like, well, you are definitely an older lady. Was probably like in her 70s. I was like, well, you've lived here for a really long time and you don't know this thing about it. And you know, and it's like it just became like this passed on history where it's like her parents probably told her not to attend the church, right? And she also told her kids, and then just kept on getting passed on. So again, this fact that we're able to like come together and have a conversation and show them like, well, sometimes it's better not to just like go with things that are already being said, but think about what is the history behind why people doing what they're doing. Because when I came across the church, I actually thought the church was racist. Like to be honest, like I was like, this doesn't make sense. Like this huge, because the church actually spans across like a block. It's a really huge church. So for me, I was like, well, I really need to dig deep and figure out like what the history of the church is. And I would have loved to like have a conversation with the church, like even the priest, but I wasn't able to do that unfortunately because like I said, yeah, on the night that I projected, it was like at midnight, cold Chicago, and it was obviously closed. I tried sending out a few emails to the church, but I didn't get a response. But I think I had a friend who lived in the neighborhood who had told me that like it seems like things are so like better, like people are starting to have conversations or like talking about actually going to the church and actually attending. So I think for me, it's with these projects. I mean, I just try to figure out like what is the impact, right? How does it impact people? Because I do not want to be the designer that just makes things to make money, right? I also want to think about like how people actually interact with certain things around us. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Mia has a question too. Hi, Jude. Thank you for sharing how your work has grown and changed. The magazine project highlighting African artists seems to be the most recent, yes? Are you designing layout for certain issues, or are you submitting your own designs for inclusion? And where do you see your work going from here? So that was several questions, but all good ones.
Yeah. Yeah, so the project is a recent one. I think we currently have 5 issues, and I think it's been happening at least once or twice a year. And as far as like my own work in there, no, I don't have my own work in there. I think my role in that particular project is being like an arts director and designer of the publication. Um, and I think the third part of the question was, in a way, you see where we're going from. Oh, yeah. So I think for me, being able to like work on some of these projects like that, I realized that and that is what actually got me into teaching in the first place, is I realized that I love being able to like have conversations and guide people to actually make certain things work. Because honestly, like I'm a listener. I like listening to sort of a lot of things. So for me, I think as far as where my work is going, I think my work will still continue to be work that highlights people's stories. Because again, I'm interested in languages, narratives, stories. So my work will definitely still end up being about highlighting people's stories. I'm still thinking about educating people in a life that, I mean, seems very different from what I was used to. Because I think for me, even my teaching philosophy is that, well, I came from a background, I mean, from undergrad in Ghana, I came from undergrad, I mean, a background where it was like more master apprentice kind of teaching, right? Where it was like, your professor knows everything. You do not question what they say. What they say is fine, or you can't say no. Like if you do, that could easily affect your grades, right? So again, having the chance to like also like come to the US and do my master's and also be having some great professors that also advised me in that same sense really gave me this sense of like thinking about, well, learning is a two-way street, right? A professor does not know all, right? It's like students will actually know way more. Like right now, I mean, classes that I'm teaching right now, like sometimes students bring up certain ideas and I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I need to like also like try to like respond to that. But then I will end up posing a question back to them. I'm like, well, what does this thing you're saying mean? And then I try to like also figure out. So I think, I mean, a short answer to your question, Nia, thank you for the question, is yes, my work will still continue to be about like facilitating conversations and getting people together to have a conversation.
Great. All right, a few more are coming in now. Joshua. Hi, Jude. Great presentation. From your work I've seen, I can tell you are motivated by both personal experience and more global phenomena. I was just wondering how making art based on these different muses fulfills you. Do you find yourself feeling different after completing artworks when they are inspired by different things?
Mm, mm. Yeah, that's a really good question, Joshua. I think there's this sense of joy. Like I get this joy or fulfillment, right? Is the word I actually use when I get to see that I've done something that actually like impacts someone, even if in a really little way, right? So for example, with the That's What She Said project, which again was a project that I really wanted to have people have a conversation about their experience during a particular time, where I just thought I was making a book that would be interesting, would be funny, we just laugh about it. But then it opened up so many doors that even I couldn't even like navigate that conversation, right? So I think for me, it's all about like I mean, my short answer to that question would be, I think it's fulfilling for me because it would just like maybe put myself on the spotlight a bit, but I'm a very private person and I I am also like a workaholic. Like when I get into work, I'm into it. So I never get a chance to like really like take a break and relax, right? Although like I try to like say that to my students a lot, but I never get a chance to do that myself. But just the fact that like a work or a project that I've worked on puts a smile on someone's face is something that really like makes me feel, well, this work or this night I did not sleep was actually worth it, right? So again, it's just about like the idea of like feeling fulfilled in that same way. Hopefully, like that, yeah, I think that's how I answer that question. But yeah, it's exciting. It's exciting. Exciting.
I had no idea how much humor and absurdity featured into your practice until your talk. So I found that to be really unexpected and I enjoyed it. So going back to the Q&A, thank you for that question, Joshua. Amma asks a question about the Black Stargate project. What would be your ideal structure to replace the Independence Arch / Black Stargate? Which I think is a really great question.
Yeah. Uh, Okay, so again, when I started working on that project, I had also like tried to like source out like opinions. I mean, literally asking people the same question, like Ghanaians back at home, or even Africans who also have like monuments in their countries that also like symbolize independence. And I think the conversation was usually revolved around the fact that it has to be something that actually represents them, their culture, right? Because for example, so Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, where I did my undergrad, has this stool entrance, which like the stool is this idea of like chieftaincy, right? It's a stool that basically represents power of the people, of the Akan people, which are a very strong tribe in Ghana. So again, I mean, stuff like that could be something as simple as like a stool. Like, what is a stool? Because a stool really represents like the African culture. And I think when you think about it, I mean, the Ghanaian culture, when you think about it, like each tribe in Ghana has a chieftaincy system. So again, that one thing or that one symbol basically cuts across and represents every single tribe within it. So it doesn't seem as if like we are not actually paying attention to a different tribe. So I think for me, if I was just to give an example, quick answers, I'll probably say like a stool, right? Could be like a good monument that could replace the arch, or it could even end up being something that even just ends up highlighting our culture, right? Like just even thinking about it, like there's there's this thing called a grinder that's basically used to grind pepper and spices in Ghana, right? It's in a bowl, right? I feel like that could even end up being a symbol because again, Ghanaians are very known to be very hospitable. Like we express a lot of like hospitality. So again, food might be the thing that actually brings us together in the same way that could even end up being like even a better representation of our culture than the current monument that sits in Accra.
I would love to build on that question. I had a similar question. I was so taken by the footage of you disassembling the sort of replica monument that you made, and I saw that almost as a performance, like an additional piece. And I wondered as you were taking apart a monument, if there's something about that. I don't know if you've shown that like as an independent or autonomous work, but something about unbuilding the monument seemed really profound to me. And then I wondered, is monumentalizing, maybe this is a question for you, is monumentalizing itself a Western impulse? Like, is there really a way to resist a monument if you're monumentalizing? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it's interesting. And I mean, the idea of like dismantling or deinstalling that monument in a gallery space was like I was like, oh, like even if I never see this vision being materialized, I was able to do it in my own way. My own little way where I was basically able to dismantle this monument on my own. And I think even with that, I mean, a part of that also was the fact that I was tired about after working like over a month on that particular project. But it just had me thinking about, well, what does, like you said, what does it mean? Like, do we even actually need like an actual monument to represent our independence, right? Because I think a big part of like cultures, different cultures also is like is documentation, right? How do we document particular cultures, for example? And I think that's a great question because another part of my practice also that I'm working on right now is like documentation of language. Because Ghana, I mean, pre-colonial times, we used to speak probably over 50 languages, but like now, due to lack of documentation, most of those languages are being lost. So again, it's like, how do we even direct our resources into something like that, right? So I think for me, like when you talk about this idea about like the performance of dismantling, right, that monument, I think for me, I showed that video to a couple of people, and I was like, well, I mean, I was actually making a joke about it. I was like, well, even if this never happens in real life, this is me dismantling a monument, so I'm doing it for you, right? So in that case, like I'm bringing all of us in to actually take this thing down, which could be an idea, but maybe one day it actually gets materialized. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to actually tear down the monument. Maybe we could repurpose it into something else.
Thanks. That I might skip, Penny, I'll come back to your question in just a second. But because you were just talking about languages, I thought it might be good to pick up Shreyas's question, which is, as someone who appreciates language so much, what do you enjoy most about the languages you work with and think in, like books and projection, installation? So I wonder, Shreyas, if Shreyas means linguistic languages and possibly visual languages.
Yeah.
That's phrased like almost a two-part question.
Yeah.
Yep. That's Reyes.
I think that's a really good question. As far as language, I think what I really enjoy about it, as far as like even like books, like making books or even projections or solutions, is sequence and storytelling, right? Like as a child, and I mean, again, the reason why I also ended up like naming this, dedicating this talk to my grandma is the fact that like she used to tell us these very interesting stories. Like storytelling was a really big thing, and it was also a way to even build community, right? On even passing down history to different people. So for me, I think it's what I enjoy the most about that is being able to document or the storytelling aspect of it, like a narrative, right? Because then again, I mean, in the words of Tina Amanda, she says the idea of like the dangers of a single narrative, a single story, right? So again, it's like for me, how can I basically think about bringing certain stories to in the sense that I can document them in a way that it can get passed on from time to time? Because I think that's something that most cultures are starting to lack, where things go undocumented. So for me, I think just to that question, what I enjoy, I mean, I said is the documentation and the storytelling approach to it. Um, Hopefully that answers the question, unless I missed something.
You get to answer the questions as you'd like, I think. That's great. Penina and Heather Bennett have some two questions as well, which I think kind of have some relationship to each other. So maybe I'll read both, if that's okay. So Penina asks, you mentioned finding your role as a designer to be to be a mediator, and most of your projects invite or create introspective experiences. Penina asks if you've thought about how the form or medium of the and presentation of the projects would change if the audience changes. For example, if you showed it to a Ghanaian audience back home, thinking specifically about the Black Star Gate, which was so powerful. And then Heather Bennett, in a similar question, asks, do you see the continuation of this Independence project, which is another that same project, taking place back in Ghana, and what might happen there?
Yeah. Yeah, I think Panina, your question is really interesting because that is something that I've struggled with a lot, like since moving to the US, is this idea about accessibility, right? How, because most of the projects I end up working on also are centered around like Ghanaians and Africans. So it's like, how can I have people that again probably do not relate to that experience actually understand it? And for me, it's like it's even something as simple as even translation. When things get lost through translation, because there are few of the projects on there, like for example, the artist books that the original text was in like Chi, which is one of the languages that we speak back at home in Ghana, that I had to translate. Where I realized that there are even certain words in Chi that you cannot even translate to English. Like it's not, you can never do like a direct translation because it takes away the meaning completely, you know. So I think for me, definitely, hopefully, if I ever get to present this work back at home in Ghana, I think I would probably end up tweaking a few things to have them be in the original state, even with the music or the sound that I actually end up playing. Another thing would also be even with the points of access, right? Because something I had to do, especially with that Black Star Gate project, was that I had to be very aware about how much information I was giving the audience that were coming in, because majority of the audience that were coming in had no connection to Ghana or to Africa. So, I mean, in a case where like I'm having to present this back at home, I would do less of the groundwork as far as explanation because they would already get it. And then it's be more about like, well, this is the thing I want us to look at. This is the conversation I want us to have. Let's talk about it, right? So again, I think, I mean, I'll definitely say, to that, I'll say yes. There'll be a few tweaks that I'll make because there'll be less translation that needs to happen, right? Because again, like a lot of things get lost in translation where it takes away the effectiveness of the message. And to Heather's point, I'm just going to quickly read Heather's question again. Key contribution.
Of maybe.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Hopefully. I'm hoping that like this actually gets like translated in that same sense. So currently a few things that I've started doing is I started making some of these hopefully you can see this in my camera, but I started making these like tiny 3D models that are basically in white PLA that the plan is that I'm going to actually start sending it to people where what I want them to do is I also want them to have an input on that, where they could also like either draw things up, mark it up, cut it out, like something to start to reimagine what the monument could look like in that same sense, where we can start to figure out like what the ideology of that is. And I think thinking a bit more into the future, my hope is to try to even document all these various like iterations that end up coming up from having people like bring in their input also, because again, that's a big part of like community building.
I love that idea of collecting how so many people might imagine the monument. Well, we're coming up on I think we might have time for one more question. We're coming up on half past the hour. Does anyone have any more questions for Jude?
Well, hopefully I've answered every question that there is out there. But if there's any more questions, please feel free to reach out to me, either through my website, or I feel like if you look me up, you could probably, like my email address is JAY, then my last name @gmail.com. You can reach me on there. You can reach me on my website, which is madeinedujwe.com. You can also reach me on there. And you can also find me on Instagram, which is Edujwe, ADEDUJWAY. Yes, because it's my name spelled backwards. So sometimes it takes me back. Yeah, it's just my name spelled backwards. As far as like retrospect.
I like that. Language games again. Well, thank you so much, Jude. That was really wonderful. And I hope those of you who are left can join me in one last round of applause for Jude.
Thank you.